Hello and welcome back to part 2 of our notes for Unit 8, Life in the Army. This is part 2 of 2. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the weapons used in the Civil War. And one of the things that we should understand as we talk about Civil War techniques and what the armies were trying to do during the Civil War, they were typically using a lot of the techniques that were used in the Revolutionary War, but the advancements had been so fast as far as the types of weapons used. They're now using weapons that are much more accurate, they're much larger, they're much deadlier, but they're still fighting in the same way. And that's one of the reasons why the casualties in the Civil War are so high. So they're still using the things that they used back in like the 1780s, but now they're much deadlier, they're much bigger. You can see the two different artillery shells. I mean, this is an actual person next to one of these artillery shells. Here's an artillery that you could put on a railroad car, and you can see the different shells and stuff here. So we're talking about a much deadlier arsenal that they have available to them, and that's one of the big reasons for the high casualties. Here's another image. You can see this particular gun is a mounted artillery gun that you could put on a railroad car and move from place to place. And then, of course, just the cannons, the artillery, that kind of stuff, much deadlier. Okay, so when we talk about the types of weapons that individual soldiers were carrying, we talked a little bit about what a musket was during the Revolutionary War. So if you remember back when we talked about a musket, the musket ball that's being fired is essentially just a round object that's coming out of a barrel. And so I think we did a little, not really a simulation, we kind of talked about how when that round metal ball is bouncing around in the barrel, the accuracy is not going to be super high because it just kind of depends on the last place that round object bounces off the inside of the barrel. At the beginning of the Civil War, they're going to start using what's called a rifle. So a rifle is different than a musket because a rifle is going to be a gun with a grooved barrel that's going to cause the bullet to spin through the air. So one of the analogies that I always talk about is when I was a kid and I was in high school, we played a lot of dodgeball. Okay, so when we played dodgeball, they would just roll out a bag with whatever kind of balls they had from PE and that kind of stuff. They would have round kind of like balls you'd use for kickball and stuff. And then every once in a while, there might be a Nerf football in there as well, okay? Well, everybody wanted to grab that Nerf football to be able to use for dodgeball because when you think about throwing a football, you can put a spin on that and you can be a lot more accurate. You can really kind of pinpoint where you're going. You can also throw it faster than if you're just picking up a round ball that you'd use for like kickball. That round ball is not going to be aerodynamic. You're not going to be able to put as much spin on it. It's just not going to be as good as something that you can spin and like rifle, okay? So the rifle is going to be a huge advancement in the Civil War. The rifles would fire something called a mini ball. Okay, now it's not mini like small. It's actually a Frenchman that comes up with this. So it's mine. Okay, so a mine ball. It's a bullet with a hollow base. So you can kind of see on this one where it's kind of like sitting so that you can see the bottom of it. It's going to have a hollow base, which is going to help it as it goes through the air. And then it's going to have these little grooves on it as it goes through the barrel. It can be shot further, and it's going to be a lot more accurate. Okay. Now, with a musket ball, a lot of times when the musket ball is going to hit somebody, the musket ball would actually lodge inside, somebody's, chest or stomach or something like that. When you shoot somebody with a rifle, it's going to be a lot different. It's going to, in some cases, actually go through the person. And in the case of a rifle, if you shoot somebody and that projectile is coming through and it hits a bone, it's going to just completely decimate that bone. Whereas if you had a musket, the bone might actually kind of like stop it from going through. So that's one of the reasons why you're going to have such a high rate of amputations. Because if you got hit in the arm with a rifle, there's probably not going to be much bone left there that you're going to be able to work with. And so that's when they would go ahead and do the amputation. So this is just kind of a chart that I found that kind of helps describe it a little bit. So when you're talking about a musket, so like when you think about the types of muskets that they would have used during the Revolutionary War, kind of down here in this area. Accurate range is going to be about 75 meters. Effective range is about 140 meters. But then when we get to the Enfield rifle, you're talking about an accurate range of like 365 compared to 75 here, okay? And like an effective range of like 685 meters compared to 185, okay? So you're going to be able to be shooting from a further distance. You're going to be a lot more accurate, and when it actually does hit the person that you're shooting at, it's going to cause some pretty extensive damage. Okay, the second thing I wanted to talk about today was the advancement of something called ironclads. Ironclads are warships that are covered in iron plates to help protect it. So ironclads actually come about in Europe in kind of like the 1840s, 1850s, but they weren't actually used in warfare until the Civil War. When we talked about at the beginning, the Union's going to have a huge advantage because they have all the ships. Okay, they have basically the entire Navy. The Confederacy is looking for some type of advantage over the Union ships. And so one of the things that they begin to experiment with is either buying ironclads from a foreign country or trying to convert wooden ships and making them into ironclads. So you could take a wooden ship and you could put iron plates on top of that wooden ship. And then within that ship, you could fire cannons out of it. And then when people would try and shoot you, because you're covered in iron, it would basically bounce off the side of your ship. So the first major Confederate ironclad was called the Merrimack. It became the Merrimack after they put the iron plates on it. And here's a picture of the Merrimack. And on this design, you can see it's kind of funky. The ship is actually down below here. And then this is the top of the ship. So inside, you would have a series of a whole bunch of different cannons that sailors would be inside this, firing out at ships. So you can imagine the huge advantage you'd have from the Merrimack if you were sailing up against a wooden ship. The wooden ship's going to be able to fire cannons at you, but they're just going to bounce off the side. You're going to be able to fire cannons directly into that wooden ship and probably cause enough damage to sink the wooden ship. Another thing people would do at sea a lot of times is they would try and get the other ship on fire because they're essentially wood and flammable objects and stuff. That's also not going to affect a ironclad because there's nothing for the ship to catch fire on. You're basically just lobbing stuff at pieces of metal. So this is the Merrimack, and this picture kind of shows you a little bit of what it would look like underneath the water. So this is what it looks like when you're just seeing it sail up to you. And then this is what's actually underneath, is like the actual ship itself. So the Confederacy comes up with the Merrimack. The Union comes up with their own version of an ironclad. Theirs is a completely different design. So theirs is a ship that has a single turret on it, and this turret spins. So there's like a series of like ball bearings here where this thing will spin. I think the other picture shows a little bit better. So you'd have a large cannon inside, but with this one, you could spin it in any direction. With the Merrimack, you'd have to spin the entire boat or the entire ship to be able to get it to change like the area in which you're shooting the cannon at. The monitor, the turret itself is going to spin. So it's kind of interesting how the two different sides had completely different designs, but they were both ironclads. So here's a drawing of it, and then this is an actual photograph, and you can see the turret here and then the cannon sticking out of the turret. All right, so there's kind of like a computer-generated picture of what the monitor looked like. So they have a famous battle in, I believe it's in 1862. It's called the Battle of Hampton Roads. And so these two ships went at each other for like about 4 hours, and they're just lobbing shells and cannons at each other, and the cannonballs are bouncing off of each other. After about 4 hours, they both basically decide it's a draw, and they retreat back. So this was the first ever battle between two different ironclads. Obviously, other countries around the world are going to see what's happening during the Civil War, and it's going to have a huge impact on naval fighting for the rest of mankind, basically. But this is the beginning of iron ships actually being used in warfare. Here's a couple more paintings kind of what that battle looked like when the Monitor and the Merrimack fought each other. Yeah, so it was March 9th of 1862. And there's another kind of computer-generated image of what it would have looked like when those two met up against each other. They did also make different kinds of ironclads that they would also use on like the Mississippi River. So here's a couple images of what some of those boats looked like that eventually were used, not just at sea, but also on like the Mississippi River. So after the first 2 years of fighting, essentially neither side really gains any kind of decisive advantage. This was a war that some predicted might only take a couple weeks. And here we are 2 years in, tons and tons of casualties, and neither side really has a definite advantage. We talked about in an earlier section of notes, the longer the war goes on, it's actually an advantage for the Confederacy, because the longer it goes on, the greater the chances that the Union's eventually going to say, we give up, we don't want to fight this war, we don't want to have all the costly casualties and stuff. So you could almost kind of technically say that by even making it to the 2-year point, the Confederacy was at an advantage. But really, 2 years in, people are not seeing one side kind of start to gain the momentum, which is going to be a pretty important precursor for the rest of the war. All right, so that is it for the second part of Life in the Army. I do have a video that I've also included on a Google Classroom that I want you to watch. It's one of those Civil War in 4 minutes one, and it talks about the advancements in naval warfare, and it talks about ironclads along with a couple other things that are kind of important to realize when we talk about like what's happening at sea during the Civil War. So go ahead and watch that as well. All right, thanks guys.